Hello everybody, it is June 21st, 2025 here in the United States of America, and in today's video I want to talk about the miscalculation made by Benjamin Netanyahu in regards to the conflict that Israel has engaged in with Iran, and how this ties into what I mentioned several videos ago about this pattern of constantly underestimating the military capabilities of non-Western nations by Western nations or nations that lie within the Western sphere of influence. And Israel is within that Western sphere of influence because most of their political capital comes from the influence they have within Europe and the United States, and much of their weaponry and supports comes from these nations. And I think Israel is still subjected to the same line of thinking when it comes to warfare, when it comes to regime change operations, when it comes to military operations as a whole. Now, I think the assumption was, when Israel had launched these strikes against Iran, was that these strikes would cripple the Iranian government, cripple the Iranian nuclear program, and bring the country to its knees relatively quickly. That was Israel's goal because, truth be told, Israel cannot afford a long war of attrition. Iran has thousands upon thousands of ballistic missiles. They have had years to harden all potential targets. They have a population of 90 million, and the terrain of Iran allows for things to be easily hid within the country in very defensible positions. Now, Israel is a much smaller nation, smaller than the state of New Jersey. There are far fewer places to hide things. Targets are readily much more accessible to be struck within the state of Israel than they are with Iran. They have a much smaller area in which to hide things. They don't have as mountainous of terrain as Iran has, and they have a much smaller population. So the calculus was, on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu, that this war could be ended very quickly, either by Israel's hand or by a quick intervention from the United States of America. Now, this goes down to this line of thought that seems to happen a lot within Western militaries and think tanks and political circles, that nations can be brought down quickly by airstrikes. If you just decapitate the leadership, the whole system comes crumbling down. Now, generally speaking, that doesn't work. Iran, again, has a population of 90 million. They have contingencies. They've prepared for things. If a key leader is taken out, then there's always somebody to take their place. And also, Iran doesn't have much of this. Comes back to what happened in the Gulf War. We'll just start there. The Gulf War was quick. It was decisive. It was won mostly with air power, and Saddam's army was more or less destroyed near the Kuwaiti border and not much further into Iraqi territory, and much of it was destroyed in a retreat away from the front lines in an event known as or a place called the Highway of Death, where retreating Iraqi military formations were utterly decimated by American air power. The war was over in a matter of weeks with minimal casualties. Now, what has happened since then is Western leaders look at this war and think that they are so technologically advanced, so much more powerful than all of their adversaries, that every war they engage in now will turn out just like this, especially if it's a Middle Eastern power. Now, Iran is not Iraq. Saddam's army was grossly overestimated at the time, which is a good thing if you're fighting an opponent. You want to always overestimate them, not underestimate them. And the Iraqi army was not as well trained as it was assumed. They were much less competent than predicted. They were not nearly as motivated to fight as people would have assumed, and it was quite apparent very quickly they did not have the air defense capabilities to deal with American air power. Now, again, like I said, it's always better, as if you're engaging in warfare with another country, that whatever country is being engaged with is overestimated rather than underestimated. It's always better, if you're a nation fighting a war, and that's any nation, to be over-prepared, not under-prepared. But unfortunately, the side effect of winning that war so decisively was that everyone involved in that war, and yes, Israel had a vested interest in seeing Saddam's army defeated, and they also did launch Scud missiles at Israel, was the assumption that Western military technology would turn every war into this kind of war, where it is a one-sided slaughter, armor formations, ground troops, aircraft on the ground are utterly decimated by Western weaponry before they can even see a target to shoot at. And the assumption seems to be, with Iran, that overwhelming Israeli air power and subterfuge and decapitation strikes could bring this country quickly to its knees and force it to come to the table and force it to surrender. That didn't work. Iran is now prepared to engage Israel in a very long war of attrition. Well, the same thing happened with Russia. The assumption was, just face Russia on the battlefield, their troops are terrible, their equipment's a joke, everything is Soviet era, they don't know how to fight, they're just a bunch of drunk, stupid Slavs. As soon as they face any kind of adversity, they'll run back to Moscow with their tail between their legs, and Vladimir Putin will be magically overthrown. Again, this didn't happen. The Russians, although initially unprepared for the kind of war they were drug into in Ukraine, composed themselves fairly quickly within a matter of months, mobilized men, and now they are fully prepared to fight the kind of war they are engaging in and are steadily winning that war. Ukraine would not have been put in the position that it was put in if Western think tanks and Western members of the Western intelligence community and politicians had actually looked at Russia for what it was and what its potential has always been. Same thing with Iran. If Western politicians, if Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli politicians and United States politicians and politicians in Europe took a good hard look at Iran and its capabilities and what the possible negative outcomes could be, then these strikes would not have happened, I firmly believe. Again, because Israel knows its own capabilities. It knows that it cannot fight a long war of attrition. It knows that its manpower resources are limited. It's currently tied up fighting in Gaza. It still has Hezbollah to its north, and it is very possible that hostile militias could still funnel in from Syria. They know this. They do not want to overstretch their military and overstretch their air force. They can't afford it. And also they have missiles still coming in from the Houthis in Yemen. Not a lot, but still here and there they do penetrate Israeli airspace and find their mark and hit targets. This is why, though, the Israeli government wants the United States to directly intervene in this conflict, because now I think it's in a position where it knows that it is grossly underestimated Iranian resolve and the amount of missiles and the technology that Iran does possess. And again, as I mentioned before, this goes back to this habitual habit of Western leaders underestimating everybody who's not part of the Western sphere of influence. Again, because they don't have magical Western technology, that their militaries can't fight. All these nations are weak. They're all houses of cards. They'll all come magically crumbling down as soon as key targets are taken out. Most of their military might remain intact. Most of their logistics are intact. Most of their launch sites are still intact. Most of their air force is still intact. All of their armor is still intact. And the population seems to be galvanized and unified based on these strikes, yet somehow, magically, that nation will fall. Another thing with Iran, too, when people talk about regime change, is that people aren't really thinking of the consequences of regime change. What happens in a nation of 90 million people filled with weaponry? Mind you, this nation is filled with weaponry. They have a fairly large military. And they also border Afghanistan and Iraq, so weapons could easily be funneled into Iran in the event of a breakdown of the government. Okay, what happens then? What happens to those 90 million people? Where do they go? Where do they flee to? What kind of pressure does this put on neighboring nations when millions of refugees are fleeing Iran, and the violence that could take place within Iran? If the civil war happens within Iran, how long will that go on for? Will it be a massive humanitarian crisis? What will that do to oil prices? A prolonged conflict in a very oil-rich nation within the Middle East. What happens then if that conflict goes on and it's terribly destructive and it goes on for years? What happens to oil prices? What happens to world economies because of that? You know, these things aren't being considered by Western leaders. And again, I'm not sitting here cheerleading for any side. I'm taking a realistic view of the situation and giving everybody out there my opinions on what would probably happen. And then I've even seen, you know, some Western military analysts say the Iranian regime will just fall. All you have to do is kill Khomeini, and all the people that don't like him will take to the streets and cheer the fact that he's gone and welcome the Western world as liberators. You know, where have we heard that story before? Is that what happened in Iraq? No. Here's the thing. Here's the thing. Even if somebody does not like their government, what they love is their land. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, when the Wehrmacht came rolling across the Soviet frontier and began decimating formations of the Soviet military and capturing hundreds of thousands of men and taking vast swaths of territory and destroying untold thousands of pieces of military equipment, the assumption was on the part of the Wehrmacht that the Soviet Union was a house of cards. If you just kick in the door, the whole rotten edifice will come crashing down. People did not like Stalin. He had persecuted the church. He had killed scores of people. There were purges, persecutions, shootings. So what Stalin did, though, was appeal to the nationalist sentiments of Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians and everyone living in the territory of the Soviet Union. This is your land, defend your land, defend Mother Russia. They weren't fighting for the system of the Soviet Union, they were fighting for their neighbors, they were fighting for their homes, they were fighting for their villages, they were fighting for their land. If there is a protracted war against Iran, where Iran feels like it's being beset on all sides by enemies, if there was ever, God forbid, some kind of ground invasion, I would dare to assume that the Iranians would probably hold a similar view in regards to fighting off invaders or aggression against their land. It wouldn't have anything to do with Ayatollah Khomeini. It would be, they would want to defend their homes and land and whatnot. This is what happened when the United States military went into Iraq. Same thing. Everyone assumed that, okay, we'll just kick out Saddam, get rid of Saddam, and everyone will just greet us as liberators. That's fine, but even the people that didn't like Saddam still took up arms against American troops because they were invaders on their land, in their villages, in their homes. That's what people fight for. They don't fight for their governments, they fight for their land, they fight for their communities, and they fight for their neighbors. So this idea that if you just invade a country where the leader isn't super popular, everyone will be on your side, and war's over, everything's fine, there's a nice neat cleanup at the end of the day, a new government gets installed and everybody goes home happy. That's not what's going to happen. It's not what's going to happen in Iran, no matter what happens. If there's some kind of ground invasion, which there's no staging area for, or if there's some decapitation strike against the Ayatollah Khomeini, there's no guarantee that the people left over will take the side of the people that just killed their leaders and then welcome the Western world with open arms. There's no guarantee of that, and in fact, it probably won't happen. Again, like this constant underestimation of other nations by people in the West, by the Israelis. Just same thing with Assad. Bashir al-Assad. Why did Bashir Assad last so long in power? The assumption was, well, Assad's a dictator. If you just have some kind of popular uprising against him, then that's it. He'll fall. War's over, everybody go home, new government gets installed, everybody's happy. That's not what happened. Plenty of people fought against what they viewed as encroachment on their land by outside forces or forces that were influenced by outside forces, and that government held on for quite a few years after the initial civil war, and the results were catastrophic for the region. You had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of refugees fleeing across the world. Syria is in a state of utter ruin at this point. It's going to take decades for the country to recover, and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars of money funneled in to rebuild the country. Was that worth it for the region? I mean, to the Israelis, sure, it might be, because, again, having a region that's left in conflict and chaos is better to them than having a government that's hostile to them. But the problem with Iran, though, like as I mentioned before, is they've vastly underestimated the capabilities of the Iranian military and its ability to penetrate the defenses of the Iron Dome. Now, if this goes on for months at a time with no results and no decisive action, and missiles are still flying in from Iran into Israeli territory, the Israelis will find themselves in a very bad situation. They need Western intervention. And even then, even if there is Western intervention or direct intervention by the United States, the assumption is by many U.S. leaders, we'll just drop a bunch of bunker-busting bombs, war's over, boom. I have a feeling, though, if the United States did get directly involved and start launching airstrikes against Iranian targets, those missiles would still be flying out of Iran into Israel and into American interests in the region. Look at the Houthis, for example. Everyone assumed, okay, these are a bunch of tribal people, they're getting weapons from Iran, they don't have any real military capability other than these advanced missiles they're getting from the Iranians. We'll just unleash American air power on them and then game over. Okay, well, a couple months later, what happened? We gave up on that. Why? Because it wasn't working. They know where to hide. They know where to hide their missiles. These people aren't stupid. They've been fighting wars for quite some time with no air power whatsoever. Look at Afghanistan. The Taliban had no air force whatsoever, no way to really defend themselves against American air power. But no matter how many airstrikes we launched against Taliban targets, who's in charge of the country now? Same thing with Iran. No matter how many bombs we rain down on Iran, I have a very strong feeling it's not going to dent their capabilities in the way that people within our military-industrial complex or political class think. Because there's plenty of other factors they don't seem to consider because they do not understand how war works. I'll just sum it up again. This is how the Western mind thinks when it comes to war. We have really good technology. We just use that technology and then we win the war. That seems to be how it works. They don't think about logistics. They don't think about how many men a country can put into the field. They don't think about the terrain of that country and how many places there are to hide. They don't think about the resolve of a populace when it feels like it's under attack. And they again underestimate the technical ability of these countries. Going back to Russia again, Russia was vastly underestimated when it came to its technical ability. In fact, many of Russian weapon systems are just as advanced as Western weapon systems, or close to. They're good enough to get the job done at the minimum, and they are much cheaper to build. The Russians aren't stupid people. Looking back on this initiative to try to arm Ukraine to the teeth and pit them against the Russians, if you look back on this with an unbiased mind and open eyes, and you actually realize what Russia's capabilities were all along, you would look at Western policymakers and say that this is suicidal stupidity and this is not going to work and it's going to just kill a lot of people and no good result will come from it. It's the same thing with Iran and Israel. Israel hoped for a quick end to this war, hoped for a decapitation strike, chaos in the streets, nuclear sites gone in one fell swoop, war's over, everyone goes home. They cannot fight a long war of attrition. Western powers, generally speaking, none of them are set up to fight a war of attrition. Israel, from what I understand, is already running out of air defense missiles, and many of these air defense missiles aren't working because they assume that technology is good enough to do whatever it needs to do, and that whatever technology is being utilized by the enemy is not good enough to penetrate their defenses, so they have nothing to worry about. That's not true. Hypersonic missiles are far too fast to intercept. And non-Western countries, Russia, China, and Iran, and probably several others at this point, are armed to the teeth with them. So I think Western leaders should take pause for a little bit before they walk headlong into military conflict. I'm just being realistic about it. Again, this video is not meant to shill for one side or the other. I have my personal opinions, but this channel generally is not for that. It's to analyze the decisions made by world leaders. Talk about why they made these decisions and the consequences of those decisions. But anyways, that's all I really wanted to talk about today. It's been something I've been thinking about all week. I will be back Wednesday with another video, and then once I switch over to daylight at my job, I will change the schedule and I will keep everybody posted on what that new schedule will be. But until then, have a great day.